Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Soldera Markets. I'm here with Alan Stenver, and I think today we're going to look over the RE100 credible claims. For those who don't know, the RE100 is like a global organization that sort of set established criteria for what counts as a strong, credible renewable energy claim. So it's super relevant to GOES and RECs. And yeah, so let's kick this off. You did the bulk of the reading on the on the RE100 document. And I mean, I took a look. It looks like they've got 6 categories, right? Do these apply to all sorts of RECs and GOES, or is it just specific types?
Well, I think the first thing we should probably start with is a bit more about just like what RE100 really is. So in Europe, as we've discussed on previous episodes, we kind of have this nice legal framework of what qualifies as an adequate renewable energy claim, right? It's kind of written into the Renewable Energy Directive. It's implemented in local laws. It's more or less streamlined to that extent. But in the era where RE100 started, which was around 2014, I believe, that wasn't really the case. Like the European geo market wasn't that well developed, very similar to the carbon market today. These kind of competing voluntary standard kind of approaches of, hey, let's just do something, figure it out. Corporates want to use renewable energy. We need to kind of enable this. And RE100 ended up being this kind of organization that set a very strict standard on what actually qualifies as an adequate use of renewable energy. And as a second thing, became this central body where very large corporates, such as Apple, such as Microsoft, such as Google, where they make a commitment that, hey, they want to use 100% renewable energy by this date. They have this kind of like timeline of when they want to get to that 100%. And they have this kind of commitment to RE100 that, hey, we're going to follow the standard and we're going to report it to you what exactly we're doing regarding renewable energy use. So they've been very useful, like Google, Apple, IKEA, a bunch of corporations, like most large corporations you could think of, you will find in their member list. Let's go back to this original question of what exactly is the standard, or what kind of criteria do they place on these kind of renewable energy claims, so we could kind of work backwards and figure out how that applies to guarantees of origin. I think that's a pretty good place to start. So for them, a credible claim is something that's based on credible generation data, something that has proper attribute aggregation. We'll talk about that a bit later. It must have exclusive ownership. So essentially, there aren't multiple people claiming, hey, I'm the one using this renewable energy. No, I'm the one using this renewable energy, right? And as a second follow-up, it is like must have exclusive claims, so there isn't double counting. So essentially, both these exclusive ownership and exclusive claims boil down to no double counting. There can't be two organizations that essentially think they're using the same thing. There can't be multiple organizations that think they own the renewable energy plant. Like there has to be this understandable central logic for who owns what and why and where and how do I validate this. It must meet geographic market boundary limitations, which just functionally means that, hey, if you are producing renewable energy in Iceland, it doesn't really make sense if you use it in France, right? Like that doesn't really check out. That energy could never have gotten to France. It requires a level of mystical thinking or this kind of very imaginative logic to get to the conclusion that, hey, I'm using energy in France, but I should consume the renewable energy part from Iceland, right? And then finally, it must be the vintage limitations. And by that, they just mean that the generation or when this renewable energy was produced, that actually has to be, and I quote, reasonably close to the consumption period, while the whole document never defines what reasonably close is. So it's kind of left up to conscious of people actually consuming renewable energy.
Wanted to comment that super interesting, and one of the things I wanted to dig in and ask you about is geographical market limitations, because right now you can buy from Iceland and sell to France, but there's of course a lot of buyers who don't do that. They say that they want pre-connected geos. What you could also do is buy from Finland or Estonia and sell in Spain. So are these going to get limited as well? And if yes, then what sort of impact will this have on the market?
Generally, the Estonian and Spanish grid through like a couple of connections functionally are connected, right? Like there is this very plausible kind of broader energy market in Europe, right? So it's I think it's called the single energy market in their own documents, but essentially it goes under their geographical limitations. So functionally you can, because there's a plausible path from Estonia to Spain. So they have this table in one of their documents that actually defines what the European single energy market is. It ultimately comes down to two factors. You need to be an AIB member and you need to be in the EU single market. So you need to have both of those boxes checked, and then you can be in the single market. So as a very surprising consequence, based on the voluntary criteria given here, you could produce in Estonia and consume in Spain, but you cannot produce in Estonia and consume in Poland. So, because Poland is not part of the AIB, they're like one of these member states that essentially they have guarantees of origin, they have all of the laws implemented, but they have not fully integrated and complied with the AIB standard of how guarantees of origin move around different registries. And because of that, they're functionally excluded. So if you are consuming renewable energy in Poland because they aren't an AIB member, by this guidance, you need to be using guarantees of origin from Poland exclusively, because from their perspective, that's essentially like a self-contained market, because it can't be like nicely exported into the other countries in the EU single market.
Why is that? Do we know why Poland still hasn't joined the AIB?
I've read blog posts about this, and the blog posts essentially say that the Polish way, how they've solved everything for like implementing the technical specification on what is guarantees of origin and how to use them and how to move them around. They did a bit of, we could say, creative implementation there. They have their own custom solution. We've had a look at it a couple of times and had like mini heart attacks every time. But functionally, it works slightly differently than what you would expect elsewhere. And while they have declared, even as late as I think last year, like middle of the year, that they want to join the AIB, it's been quoted that they simply do not currently meet the technical criteria to be able to integrate. Interesting consequences in Poland, for example, are there is no such thing as like an easy, simple transfer from one account to another. There is a purchase from one account to the other. It needs to essentially be done in like a video game trade offer style where both sides accept, and like it works differently from other countries where you could essentially just send guarantees of origin to an account and say, hey, there you go. It has a different structure of a transaction. It has different ways how it works, because essentially I don't think their generation data is as well reported to the people who are actually managing the registry as in other places, because the people that have the data and the organization you're actually sending the data to and the people operating the registry, these are different organizations and they somehow need to get along in the background as well. So it's a bit more messy in Poland, and I think all of these things have just created enough friction that it's going to take time.
Happened this year?
I hope so. It would be cool. But, everything moves at the speed of government, and sometimes that's not too fast.
Yeah.
I guess other, like, maybe surprising geographical limitations that you can read from this document are Romania's not part of AIB either, so that's out. Bulgaria's not an AIB member, so that's out. Serbia is not an EU single market member. Perhaps the most interestingly, Ireland is not grid connected to the single market, so it's also a self-contained market. So both countries are out. The UK obviously has its own system, so that's out anyway. So in short, mainland Europe, European Union, AIB, then you basically have something that approximates what this group is that is acceptable.
But I mean, from market liquidity perspective, it's good that the European AIB is going to stay together. One of the concerns I've heard a lot of people discuss is that if we, become country level instead of like reconnected like we have right now, then there's going to be a lot of questions how the liquidity will look like, how the country prices between countries could have massive differences depending on supply and demand. Actually, it wouldn't be good for stability, especially in markets where the demand is very large, because there would be huge spikes in prices, which will cause a lot of frustration among buyers. So, like, I'm glad to hear that it's gonna keep like AIB reconnected level, because there were a lot of talks last year. I heard a lot of people talk about country level reconnected solutions.
I love how you were mentioning this, because actually in the document, it also mentions something about impactful purchasing. So one of the things that they do mention is you can have even stricter preferences if you believe it has a more positive impact on the market and promotes the things that you want to see. So under these criteria, it would be considered impactful if you sourced from your area, sourced from things that do not receive government support, all of these things. While they're not limitations, it is kind of implied that, hey, it would be nice if you thought about, like, how do you maximize impact? And part of this is, hey, I want to be like really close by, and I want to consume guarantees of origin that were produced in the same month consumed my energy. And if you do all of those things, that's essentially more impactful, since you're just like trying to be as legitimate, as like close to reality as you possibly can.
So do you think a month is the sort of, you said reasonable was never ever explicitly defined. Do you think most people consider a month?
It really depends. You have to kind of zoom out and think about how it is right now. So right now, we have this situation where a guarantee of origin, once it's issued, there's a 12-month trading period, and then depending on country, a 6-month period where you can still use the guarantees of origin, even though you can't move them out of your account anymore. And if you have this kind of a system, it's definitely better than using the stuff produced 18 months ago, right? I think we can all agree that makes a lot of sense. Ideally, in a perfect world, it would match very closely to the energy market, but functionally pulling that off becomes very complicated because it's so granular, it's so specific, it's so niche. If you get to this basis of, no, we're going to match the 15-minute hourly market, you end up essentially creating a very challenging market environment for these things to actually find their buyers, to actually find their consumers. So while the hourly stuff is excellent, and I think that's a good direction to go into, we, I think, also need to actively see the market mature to the point where the whole market could support that, right? Currently, in the guarantees of origin market, we have like 2 or 3 major exchanges where functionally large organizations could trade guarantees of origin, and that's done on a monthly auction basis. And what you see there is the cost of doing those transactions, even though it's very, you could say, like low resolution, right? You're trading kind of blocks of things. Even there, you see that the fee structure is so massive that if you were like a 128 gigawatt hour a year renewable energy producer, you'd still be paying well above 10% of the value of the deal just in transaction fees, right? So if you're looking at it from that kind of a perspective, if you create a really complicated market in the middle, the fees just become untenable for the market as well. So kind of the market needs to value these things, and then we can get into like nitty gritty details, right? That's at least how I think about it.
I'm interested about the geographical restrictions and how governments are kind of the obstacle here. So I've actually, I'm looking at a sort of map of the connectivity of Europe, and you mentioned Ireland as an example. But obviously an EU member state, but they are, there's an underground circuit connection between Ireland to the Europe. It's just via the UK, right? So that's why.
Yes, and
Yeah.
I think the rule was that you had to have connections to 2 other countries, actually,
Right.
for it to be. I seem to remember that was the case, but functionally, there are pretty strict requirements on what a interconnected market looks like.
It's just frustrating though, because let's say you're based in like Netherlands or something. There's a strong geographical, credible claim to a geo that would be produced in the UK, right? Because it's like a short hop, except the regulatory frameworks just don't align, right?
Yeah, that's currently the case. The UK has essentially siloed themselves into a very niche market at this point. It used to be that you could actually move these guarantees of origin across border a lot easier. The UK used to be on the EU guarantees of origin system, but ever since they broke off, they kind of went off and did their own thing. Then they had this period of, hey, we can allow some interchange between these things, and now they've gone like, no, there's no interchange. Like we're just doing our own thing.
RE100 document is not only about guarantees of origin, right? It's actually global. So because the European guarantees of origin are actually regulated by the RED 3 directive coming up and the RED 2, and how are all these things and different documents?
The Renewable Energy Directive, yeah.
Yeah. So how are these documents connected? Are they just like suggestions, or are they actually like essentially guidelines for upcoming laws and directives, or can they be like completely different actually when they end up in European geos, or how are all of these different docs and organizations connected?
So they were kind of created in this era where the whole concept of like a credible claim wasn't completely figured out yet. And you also need to think about the organizations that are in RE100. They are not like single country hyper local organizations. They're generally multinational giga corporations that have energy use in all continents and most countries, right? And if you're on that kind of a scale, it becomes a bit more important to have a standard that just gives you guidance on each of those countries, and you need to do that in like the broadest possible way. So when at the start of the podcast we discussed this 6 criteria that has to be satisfied when it comes to the EU guarantees of origin market, it's very easy to satisfy it because, functionally government handles data, government handles ownership, government handles attributes, government handles the cancellation part. There's a verifiable consumer for it. All of that is solved, and that's just because of the Renewable Energy Directive and the local laws that actually implement this. While in other countries, there is a more free market voluntary aspect to it, where the renewable energy consumption isn't necessarily codified by law, but is more codified by local organizations that just have received this kind of acceptance that, yeah, this is acceptable. But essentially, they created a criteria of what qualifies as good enough. And if you can't have good enough, what do you do then? I think the Q&A also provided some interesting highlights, which I think it's interesting to talk about. One of the things in the Q&A that really, I don't know if it surprised me, but was just like an interesting thing to highlight. So yeah, I wanted to highlight specifically question 37 in that Q&A, which was, why do we have to buy renewable energy in Costa Rica when the grid is over 99% renewable? I found that question to be fascinating and very provocative, because often when you talk to traders in Europe or when you talk with renewable energy market participants in Europe, they kind of mention that, hey, I don't think this market will even exist in, 10 years or 15 years or whatever, because the whole energy production in Europe is going to be 100% renewable. So everything will be solved, and, you don't need these things to even have certainty that your energy is 100% renewable. And I found it interesting because Costa Rica is kind of this microcosm or this small example of what's the practice in a country where renewable energy is most of your grids, approaching 100% of your grid. And in there, very interestingly, RE100 guidance is essentially because you have a registry that does manage the energy certificates, because it is specifically consumed by somebody, because this system exists, you have to use this system. Otherwise, it conflicts with their criteria of no double counting. Because if you say that, hey, just they're producing 99% renewable energy in this country, my energy therefore is 99% renewable, you might be actually claiming this renewable energy consumption with somebody else that actually does have these certificates. So in that situation, you're no longer actually complying with the criteria, which seemed very interesting. So when I ask you to use renewable energy, as long as these kind of registries exist, there has to be this understanding that simply using energy from the grid is not enough to have certainty that you're not actually making a conflicting claim with somebody else. You're not actually kind of misrepresenting the facts on the ground, since if somebody is actually on 100% renewable energy and the grid is at 99, well, if somebody uses a very specific, 100%, then instead of 99, it might be less. And what you end up with actually might be a lot dirtier than this 99%.
Very interesting. Do you happen to, off the top of your head, know like what are the prices they're paying for Costa Rica's racks?
I'd be fascinated to know this. I think it's a small enough market that I haven't seen prices floating around and I haven't looked into it. I would love to know, so maybe we can update this in like a future episode and talk about it.
Yeah, that'd be interesting because especially in some large utility firms, I've met people who are convinced that by 2030 the entire rack market is gone because we'll be 100% renewable, which is I think super optimistic to be honest. But they truly believe it. I currently don't see that happening, unfortunately. But like at the same time, it does make sense that you sort of want to have these trackings work because we're digitizing the whole world, we're tracking everything, and if we have reliable automated systems where the cost of running them is near zero and we can like very precisely direct how does the power and the value flow around the system, uh, I think that's very important because who knows what sort of different financial instruments and data you can build on top of it. You can make country specific analysis comparisons. Like it brings a lot of good if you can reliably and effectively track things, even if you're close to 100%, assuming of course running the system is efficient and is not just an overhead.
Yeah, exactly. If the system kind of removes more value than it adds, it becomes a problem. So
Yeah.
if you are at exactly this like 99.9999999% renewable energy production in the country, and you don't really have, for example, exports, I don't think it would make sense to have this kind of registry system at all. I think we all agree on this. Because functionally, I think perfect is the enemy of good, and if you want to have perfect, you will end up just paying so much to get to perfect. While if truly your energy production is 100% renewable, does it really justify having this kind of a system? I think that's a really important question. Yeah, if you specifically zoom in to Costa Rica, ultimately they are connected with Panama, they are connected with Nicaragua. It's not that straightforward that everything stays the same after production. On consumption side, you still need accounting. If you're this kind of perfectly isolated market where nothing goes in, nothing goes in, nothing comes out, then you're in a situation where functionally you could just make a blanket claim that, hey, everything's fine, like we don't need to think about it. But the moment it gets a bit more complicated, and the moment somebody actually needs, hey, as a corporation, we have this policy, I want to use 100% renewable energy, now you have a problem, right? Because if 50% of energy, in an example, if your renewable energy generation is, let's say, 90% of the whole profile, but 80% of renewable energy is consumed by corporations like with this kind of tracking system, then actually what ends up left in the grid is not just 10% dirty energy, it's now, half dirty energy. So you can get to these kind of scenarios quite easily, even if you have high renewable energy generation overall.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
The better question is kind of when Costa Rica or if Costa Rica does hit 100% renewable, whether the registry, because you think it's kind of semi-obvious that they should be kind of disabled at that point. I'm unsure because it opens up to like societal risk as well. There's no guarantee that number won't go back down again. I mean, the energy mix won't change based on like political factors. I mean, I think tracking, I kind of side with Stenver in that it's probably beneficial in nearly all cases, right?
Nearly all. I do agree. I think if you're a self-contained isolated system with nothing in, nothing out, and you just have this strong legal framework that no, we're literally never using anything that's not renewable ever again, then in that case, hey, congrats, like, problem solved.
Yeah, you win.
Yeah, you win. Congrats. But I think that's very hard to achieve. And I think, Oliver, you do raise a very good point that the political realities on the ground might not, stay the same. They might not be the same in 10 years, in 15 years. So the idea of, hey, let's delete tracking altogether to just reinvent it in 10 years also might not be real.
Yeah, tracking like the geos and the renewable energy credits does create like a lot of interesting situations and make people think. Like I heard in Norway, a lot of people were suddenly surprised to find that their electricity contains nuclear. They were like, "How did that happen? You know, we're renewable in this country. Why do I have nuclear in my power mix?" What happened in reality was that the nuclear guarantees of origin were simply bought and used, and but people are confused about that and how does this work. But it does send like a clear message as well that people care about this stuff. They shouldn't just sell away all their geos and buy it back from other countries or not at all, and then have dirty energy in the mix. So that's one of the things about having interconnected grid. Essentially, it exposes this stuff to the people.
So it seems to me that like having these larger market boundaries, just going back to the geographical factor, we kind of criticize the UK for siloing, but are they going to have a more effective growth rate for renewable installation, assuming that the proceeds from RECs and GOs are going to go towards a further development? I'm just curious.
I think that's a really good question. I think you could start breaking this down more and more into why not just in the UK just go like, no, Great Britain, like that's our silo now. We're just supporting Great Britain, or even just go like zoom in more. No, we're just only buying renewable energy from a couple kilometer radius from London. Or, you could get very specific with this. And is that necessarily helpful? I think is a very good question. Generally, I think you want to have energy production where it's at. It's like the most cheapest economically to achieve that, because it does cost something to move energy from point A to point B. And I think the proximity factor will play a role anyway in this whole system, because if you're producing a lot of renewable energy in an area where actually it's oversaturated already, the market reality will hit you quite hard. So I'll give you a good example of this. In many countries, for example, because storage hasn't been figured out to the degree where it could be, solar energy tends to have quite a high spike. Because we haven't figured out energy storage to the degree that the market requires right now, in many areas, the times where the sun is shining the most, we essentially have electricity prices that are close to zero, right? So there are, I think, other market factors that generally tell you where to put the renewable energy production to begin with, because certain areas just might be more fitting for that. And I think that'll already put the thing where it's at. But generally, if you're supporting the concept of renewable energy, you could get very local about it. I think there's merit in that. But are you doing that for patriotic reasons, or are you doing that for general improvement or betterment reasons? I think those are very important questions. Because ultimately, if we have this large interconnected grid, everything's connected to everything, you do have this expectation that if renewable energy production goes up, everybody generally benefits, right?
For sure. And I guess if you like go down the hyper localization sort of ideology, you just end up at like PPAs and
Yeah, you can. But now changing topic to another interesting thing that I think is worth talking about. So Stenver previously mentioned the use of nuclear energy. And I think there's a broader debate if nuclear energy is renewable or sustainable or adequate. I think there are many reasons why it could be considered significantly better than coal, for example. I don't think that's like very controversial. But should it be considered renewable? When it comes to the RE100 position, it definitely isn't. And even among things we do consider renewable, there are even more stricter limitations. So the only renewable energy in Europe that you just can take from anywhere and just use it and ask no more questions ends up being wind, solar, geothermal. That's it. So what you might notice here is I didn't say hydropower. It didn't happen. You might also notice I didn't say biomass, because we have discussed biomass. You can get guarantees of origin for biomass. They count, legally speaking, as renewable energy for your energy consumption. All that works. RE100 places this limitation on it that, yes, you can use hydropower. You can use biomass. but it needs a third-party certification. It needs a lot more checks and balances to make sure that it's fine. So in Europe, that might be the eco energy standard, which is kind of a extra layer on top of guarantees of origin for the stamp of approval that, hey, it's not ecologically harmful. For hydropower, generally, depending on the kind of situation you have on the ground, it can very negatively affect the local wildlife. It can affect the biodiversity in the area. It can cause floods in areas that previously weren't flooded. It can essentially shift the landscape, right? And that can have very negative consequences on the surrounding area. And for that reason, by default, hydropower is not considered adequate for RE100. Similar thing goes for biomass. You need a third-party certification of, hey, the sourced biomass really makes sense for this case. There's been like more checks and balances than just the government looking at it, going like, hey, okay, this is ecologically acceptable. You can consume this without having those kind of doubts of, did I actually cause harm with this?
That is super interesting. Do you see this leaking, or I guess leaking is the wrong word, but like transferring over to the European geo directives as well? Because let's be honest, right now the prices are basically set by Nordic Hydro across
Yep.
the Europe.
I was gonna say it's usually coincidental if like
Yeah. So what's your thoughts on that one?
It does feel like RE100, while as I understand it, they do pay premiums for getting that kind of stuff that they want. When it comes to the market prices, when you look at solar, when you look at wind, they don't get a premium significantly over hydro. Hydro is traded the most. There isn't, I guess, to that extent, extra demand for solar and wind. Because when you kind of zoom out and see what's getting moved across borders, what really makes the market in guarantees of origin, it ends up being Nordic hydro. It ends up being massive hydropower from Norway. It just kind of, I want to use the word floods. It floods the market with hydropower guarantees of origin, and that ends up setting the market. So anybody that doesn't follow these kind of standards ends up getting the hydropower price, right? And even if you look into solar, it feels like there isn't, to that extent, more demand for these kind of hyper-specific things, that you could see it on a very broad market top-down view. Is that going to change over time? Currently, I personally don't see any indication that it is changing. I don't think across the time we've been looking at the market, we haven't seen major broad shifts or kind of detaching price of solar going. So I think if more organizations start adopting these kind of policies, or God forbid, Germany says, hey, hydropower is completely off the table or whatever, I think we're going to see the premiums change immediately, like that. But up until that happens, I just think there are so many organizations and so many consumers of energy that kind of don't care past the point of it's renewable energy, that they don't end up asking these questions. While corporations have to often ask these questions because, well, internally they have this organization that wants to do good. I think this is true in many organizations, but also in a lot of organizations, they just want to avoid the bad optics of, hey, by the way, this organization has actually been doing harm with their policies. They've been doing bad things. Look at all of these good intentioned, seemingly actions that they've masked as this is best industry standard, this is what we're doing. And then when you look closely, you see devastated areas because they've been supporting the wrong kind of energy or something, right? I think they're more afraid of this than the average consumer of renewable energy, than the average factory, than the average corporation that isn't part of RE100.
So do you think that's what attribute aggregation as one of the criteria was trying to achieve, forcing people to own also the negative side effects of?
I love that question, and I promised that we would talk about attribute aggregation at some point. The thing is, why attribute aggregation was a specific thing mentioned here was there has been attempts. I don't know if there are any more of these left significantly in the market, but there has been attempts to break off specific parts of the renewable energy production profile into different certificates. So, for example, you can say that you're using solar energy, but you can't say that you have the CO2 or, you know, climate impact of using solar energy. These kind of things, right? So like the carbon footprint gets made into a separate attribute and sold separately from the technology.
Carbon credit, right?
Yeah. And it's there have been historically like attempts to kind of break it up into even more details. And what this attribute aggregation actually says is if you're in a market that has done this, you can't just buy technology solar and say it's done. You have to buy all of the separate pieces and put them back together and then it's done. So that's why that exists there. I don't know of a single market right now that actually uses this kind of a system. I haven't seen it. I guess this might be a scenario, for example, in India. For the sake of example, let's say somehow you've gotten voluntary carbon credits for your wind park or something. And then at the same time, you're getting renewable energy credits in this like IREC standard, which give you renewable energy usage, and then you have the carbon credit on the side. Functionally, they say if this kind of a situation has happened, no, you need both. You need like to put it back together, otherwise it's nonsense.
I tend to agree. One of my previous companies, we actually did deal with carbon credits, and we met some, let's say, mega fossil fuel companies of the world who actually were putting a lot of effort into breaking down all the attributes into individual pieces so they can slap on them to different products and claim that's clean water, that's clean air, whatever, like everything, like literally. And
Yeah. Because there are the ESG benefits. So essentially, there's the UN goals of important topics, and then they break off like ending poverty is its own thing. Like clean water is its own thing. Quality education is its own thing, and these are like properties, and we're gonna sell them separately.
But in practice, what we see happen is a farce, right? Because what really happens is that people just like, it's just too much information. Nobody can like truly understand if it actually checks all the boxes. You'd have to do like lots of research. And because a lot of these ESG attributes and guidelines are, let's just say, they're not like, you can interpret them in many different ways depending on who you talk with, and you can fulfill them in a lot of very different ways. Then what ends up happening is that you can just optimize buying the attributes that are important, sell everything else away, and in the end nobody can in practice track or even hold you accountable if you actually did what you promised to do.
In some sense, that's the free market ideal, right? For these kind of systems, the more obscure, the more hard to audit, the more hard to track you make them, the less auditable it is, and the less auditable it is, the easier it is to get away with doing whatever, right? That those are kind of downstream consequences of what's happening here, and I think it's very important. Yeah, the attribute aggregation, I think we've discussed and we all agree that it's an important thing that if this kind of thing exists in your market, you can't just go like, no, we're buying technology solar. Somebody else is getting the benefits of we're ending poverty in the region, and somehow that's taken out of the solar, put into another product, sold to another corporation. The carbon footprint taken out, sold to another corporation, and you just get technology solar. That's all you get. Do not dare make any other claims about it. It gets too complicated.
It does remind me of this anecdote that I heard once, is that a son goes to a father and tells him that, hey, father, can you please teach me how to become rich? And then the father says, well, take out the sausage from the fridge. So the son does that. And then the father says, well, take a knife and cut it to pieces. And the son cuts the sausage to pieces and says, now what? And then the father says, well, look at your fingers. Did they get fatty or greasy?
Yeah, are we covered in sausage?
Okay.
Well, congratulations. That's your profit.
Makes sense. So yeah, I guess we did go over the 6 criteria.
Last one, actually. Finally, I think a really interesting rabbit hole in the whole document I was reading was project commissioning date, or this commencement commercial operations date. So specifically, if you have, let's say, if you have a solar park, it can't be older than 15 years for you to use the renewable energy from it. That's part of the rules. So if it's too old, RE100 companies won't use it. We've even in the market seen preferences which are significantly stricter than this 15 years. We've seen 5 years as well. So it can't be older than 5 years. But there is this preference of, hey, I want to support renewable energy production that hasn't paid off yet. It hasn't gotten to the point where, everything else is gravy. Like, we paid off the production, doesn't really matter too much anymore. Everything past this point is profit. We paid off the loans. Everything's great. And the point is to more motivate newer construction and get that to be more rewarding. What I found to be surprising among this is if you're using less than 15% renewable energy under this RE100 guidelines, you are allowed to use production devices that are older than 15 years, but only up to the 15%. Who argued for that loophole to be put in? I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure. Looking at it, I don't think I get it. But there is this thing that, hey, if the first 15% of renewable energy, we won't put this requirement on you. Everything past that point, you have to have your facilities. So if you're using 50% renewable energy, 35% of that has to be newer facilities. 15% of that can be older facilities.
It's especially interesting since you said it almost excludes hydro. So, those are actually probably the bigger players who will benefit from this one.
It does almost exclude hydro. A lot of the Norwegian large-scale energy generation that they have over there is older than 15 years. They've made these huge projects. I was just surprised when I saw the number 50%. I would have loved to see the discussion that led up to this. Somebody had to have very strong opinions and had to push it very hard with a lot of pull in order to get this kind of thing approved. It just looks strange.
Well, we need to obviously invite one of authors of this paper to this podcast and find out.
Drill them on the specific.
Yeah, I would love to learn more.
I'm curious, like from a buyer perspective, looking at the commission date, how is that data sort of displayed when it comes to purchasing? So, what is it like simple in terms of breaking that down?
Yep. When it at least comes to guarantees of origin, this kind of data exists on every single guarantee of origin. There's a set of data that exists always, and that's country. That is, how big is the production facility? So, is it 50 watts or is it 100 watts? Or is it 2 megawatts? This is written down. Supported, not supported. So has it ever received government support for either the construction or the ongoing production of energy? If it does, then there's a flag on the guarantee of origin that says that. And then there's country of origin. I believe there might be a couple of more things, but generally, I think we haven't seen too much interest in those. Well, in addition to the things I mentioned, I just remembered, obviously, there is when it was produced. I think, that's kind of implied. That's part of the picture anyway. But a lot of the data about the actual production facility that made the renewable energy is attached to every single guarantee of origin. And if it moves throughout the European Union's AIP system, even if it lands in another registry, that data is still there.
Super interesting. I think we should do a actual specific sort of conversation about the sort of buyer preferences and what it even looks like in terms of distinguishing. I'm super interested in that. It's obviously some of those would mean geos have more or less value than. But yeah, we're kind of out of time, so I think we should wrap here. But it was a super informative episode. I'm gonna drop the link to the credible claims document as well if people are interested in that. And yeah, thanks guys for coming.
And also, if anybody has any questions, then obviously ask them. Happy to dive deeper and answer them. This was a pretty deep dive, and we can go way deeper than that as well.
All right. All the best. Bye.